In this section, we're going to talk about contouring. Now, contouring is something that I typically do not do. For the most part, because I like the lighting that the photographer usually enables with the shot itself before we get into post-production. However, I do get requests on how to do that and how to contour in ways that I recommend doing. And there are ways I don't necessarily recommend doing and ways that I think no one should really do. So with that thought in mind, let's get into this. We have an image here by Dixie Dixon. This is not retouched, it's simply exported out, and I didn't do anything else to this except for exporting. Now, when we talk about contouring in specific, we are emphasizing the highlights and shadows so they pop a little bit more. Now, typically the way that I've seen contouring done in addition to the lighting that's already provided on set is they will simply do the typical dodge and burn method, but instead of doing it in a pixel-oriented fashion, they will focus very much so on larger areas. For instance, over here, when we have areas of the leg, we are simply going to add some sheen. And contouring is just that. It's adding sheen to particular areas of highlights and shadows to further emphasize structure. And it can also be done on the face. And it's done as a means to enhance certain areas. Let me close out that for a minute there. Not now. There we go. So when I turn that on and off, you'll notice that the highlights are accentuated, which is not a bad thing. And it's very good to do contouring if you have an idea of what you want to do. It's not something that has to be done every single time. It's an additional step, which is why I'm bringing it up now. And then with the burn itself, you can use your lower flow to adjust. And darken some of those areas. The other thing contouring can do for you is it can thin out particular areas by the illusion of it being thinner when there's more contrast in a global sense. So you can notice like her leg, for instance, now when it has that range of contrast, it does pop a little bit more and it looks a little bit thinner. So it really depends on your end goal. It's not something that you have to do. It's not something that it's completely necessary, but it really does depend on what you're trying to get out of it. With also, the contouring aspect is interesting because you're not simply just dodging and burning in any which way. You're figuring out what you're trying to enhance and what you're trying to make thin and, bring out a little bit more. You can contour the eyes as well. But the downside of doing it in this way is you're doing it by hand and you're trying to override the initial lighting that's already present. The problem for me that I didn't like about that is it became very obvious. When you have a keen sense of lighting, a keen eye for the way light falls and the way shadow falls on the ground as well, you know what has been modified in terms of lighting in post-production. Because when you modify lighting in just particular areas, it won't match the rest of the scene. It only works if it matches the rest of the scene. Or otherwise you have this internal giveaway and it becomes very stylized. So you have to really think about do you want something that's really stylized or do you want something that is intentional? And there's a give or take in both situations. But with contouring, there's many ways to also contour. Again, aside from that, there's even ways to do it by adding a simple blank layer set to soft light, which is what our soft light dodge and burn action here does. And it's the same thing, but as I mentioned with the soft light, the underlying saturation doesn't move as well. So sometimes the colors can become desaturated, muddy in comparison to what you'd expect. The other downside is sometimes you go too far and you don't have control over that. Well, it kind of reminds me of frequency separation because you're moving around different tones, but in this sense you're moving around the lighting and you don't have that control. You don't really know when it's done, when it isn't, if it's too much, if it isn't. So instead of that, let's actually go into another method that I like doing because it really makes it simple for me. It makes it simple because I don't really need to control every general area. It's going to do it for me. in how much to go, where to do it, and so forth. So let's hide that for now. I'll put this as contour 2, and these two I'll put together as contour 1. Okay, I'll turn that off. The way that I like to do it is there's one of two ways. First, let's go into the black and white here, and I'll go into soft light. Now, I'm going to invert this real quick. Now, when it's set for me, I'm going to simply paint on the skin range. And I haven't tried this before, so I have faith that it's going to recognize the shadows and highlights and kind of map it out for me in a sense. So let's turn it on and off. So you see how we've applied this contouring here. It really pops, and it also takes care of where the shadow placement's going to be, the highlight placement's going to be, where it should brighten, where it should darken. Let's look at the leg, for example, right? Obviously this has not been retouched, but you can see this leg, right? You see this anatomy here, the structure. It's maintaining its muscular curvature. It's maintaining how it should look. It's darkening the ridge over here, but it's also brightening this area here. And it's also darkening the range in between. And it's almost like micro dodging burn, but in a very specular sort of way. And I like that look a lot. It feels like it's still staying true to the shadows and highlights. It looks very commercial. She stands out, but not so much. And you can apply it to the rest of the image as well in small amounts, maybe to just the foreground here and tapering it off to the main foreground, you know. Then that way it blends in with the whole look of the scene, where it creates this illusion. It looks like this has been lit separately. And it's really nice. I really like it a lot. You'll see that a lot of my images where it just stands out. That's kind of what I like to do. When you compare that to, say, this level of contouring, you know, you're brightening and darkening, but at the same time, you're not really paying attention to what should be darkened if something is brightened. Like I've brightened this area here, but I didn't darken it enough down here. And that allows a difference in the way lighting falls. And when you let someone, even myself, try to overcompensate what the lighting should be, something just looks off. It looks amateur, and I feel like it's not the look that I like personally. And when I turn that off and I turn this on over here, you can see an appropriate emphasis of lightening and darkening in various areas. Again, personal preference and taste, but I feel this was a good way of actually doing it. And you can tone it back because you have a mask as well. And that's one way. Another way is very simply put, is also doing it through levels or curves. For example, if I put a levels here, and then I bring in the shadows here like this, and then I taper in the highlights until the skin itself is almost clipped, not looking at the histogram. And then I go to my layers. Now if I inverse this, use a brush set to white with a flow of 10%. Let's do 20. It kind of has that same effect. So you see here, it just pops. It really pops. It also, in this one, the saturation also goes for a ride. It changes the saturation as well. Even cooler is with levels, you can change your midpoint right here. So in case you feel like you want something deeper, you can do it that way. In case you want to tan the skin a little bit more, that's a way to do it, which is a great way to do it. You just take your highlights down that way and keep the midtones coming down a bit. It's a great way to tan. Let's try that. See? So there you go. Tanning skin like that. And also then contouring by just pinching the highlights and shadows in and then just adjusting the midtones to kind of the balance that you want. That's the pros and cons of using levels, which I like this balance a lot. With the black and white, you're kind of in the, you're subject to using only these sliders, which can also work quite well because it operates on color more than light. With levels, it's light-based. With the black and white, you can see that if I use this yellow here, then it adjusts the actual tone of the skin and the reds too. So if I go all the way down, it gets really crunchy. You don't want that. If I go all the way up on the yellows, it gets really pale. So you can even out the overall impact and I guess, tanning or brightening of the skin that way too. So it's kind of cool. And then also it does everything for you at the same time. So if you feel like you like this level of contouring and you want to tone it down, you just bring the saturation, the opacity down and do it that way. So it's almost like advanced contouring for me personally. I like it a lot. And of course you have the soft light method, and then you have the manually adding method. But when you look at it this way now, the adding it manually doesn't have that same nice impact that this black and white does, or even the levels for that matter. So there you have it. Now when you take a look at how you contour based on some of these varied ideas, we've taken a look at 4 levels of contouring and darkening the skin and lightening the skin. And that's kind of, you know, how I would approach these situations where you need to change the volume of how these shadows and highlights look in a very natural way, but also controlling the luminosity and color as well. With levels, you control a lot of the saturation too, and you control how contrasty it is. With the black and white, you're basing it off the color of the skin tone using some of the sliders. And, you know, overall, it just depends on your goal, how quick you want to do it, and what you prefer using the most. And hopefully with these techniques, you can bring some pop to your images and some tanning or brightening to whatever it is that you're trying to do.